Thursday Flow. What if the situation isn't the real problem? Welcome to Thursday Flow, a space to pause, reflect, and reset for the week ahead. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the hero's journey and what happens when life changes in ways we didn't necessarily choose, and about the journey of finding our way forward. And today, I want to take that conversation a little deeper. Because sometimes we think the problem is what is happening to us. But what if the situation in front of us isn't actually the whole problem, isn't the whole story? What if there is something underneath it that is influencing how we experience it? And perhaps even more importantly, what if understanding that gives us some choice, gives us back some choice? Have you ever noticed this? Have you ever found yourself in a completely different situation with completely different people, and yet somehow you're feeling exactly the same way? Perhaps you feel, I'm not good enough. Actually, that happened to me at the beginning of my coaching when I was put in a room of people who had been coaching for years, and I thought, oh, I'm not good enough to be in here with these people. I've been rejected. And they didn't get back to me with an answer to my text. I've been rejected. I'm being overlooked. I'm going to be abandoned. I've disappointed somebody because they didn't get back to me. I need someone else to reassure me that I'm okay. And you might look at the situation and think, why does this keep happening to me? But perhaps there is another question we could ask. Why does this affect me in this particular way? And that's a very different question. And when we ask the question why, I often think about the layers of an onion, asking the why more than once to get right down to the core, to the essence of it. Why does this affect me in this particular way? And you give an answer. And then you say, well, why is that important to me? And you just keep digging. Because sometimes what is happening around us is touching something that was already there. A belief, a fear, an old wound, a story we've been carrying around for a long time. Now, in my recent webinars, presentations, we've been talking about the stories we learn about ourselves. And most of them come from a very young age. We begin forming beliefs about ourselves, other people around us, and the world. And as I said, most of it is we inherit it. Sometimes we learn, I have to please people to be accepted. Isn't that what we as parents have inadvertently done to our children over time? Oh dear, when they do something good, we praise them and tell them how good they are. These days, the use of language has come ahead in such leaps and bounds that, a lot of us are more aware to that. And so we used to, back in my old days, what we said and how we spoke to our children, it really did influence. Do this and you will please mummy or daddy. Keep your room nice and neat and tidy and you will please mummy and daddy. I have to be worthy to achieve. I have to achieve to be worthy. In other words, if you don't achieve, you don't get the recognition. People I love eventually leave. That's a common thread. My needs aren't as important as everyone else's. And I think for the baby boomers, the mums who have come through that, my gosh, we were the mother, the wife, and then we went off and worked, and we basically wore at least 3 hats. If you're a grazier's wife, you wore even more hats. You did the book work. You got out there in your spare time and you worked the farm alongside him. I have to be strong. And that came through loud and clear, actually, through my divorce. I was listening to an interview with Demi Moore when she lost her children, chose to walk away from her. And she said, my biggest mistake was when I was going through the difficulties, I demonstrated to my children that I could hold it all together. And so when the proverbial hit the fan and I lost my capability to hold it all together. And I became this person the children had never ever seen before. And that happened with me. Obviously, there were challenges in my marriage, and I held it together so that the children could see the glossy part of it and didn't become involved with, yeah. And that was really not the right thing to do, because we are all vulnerable at various times, and children need to see that this is just a part of life. I can't let people down, particularly as a mother and as a wife. That comes home loud and clear. I need someone else's approval to know that I'm okay. And perhaps that comes through being an employee. And most of the time, we're not walking around consciously thinking these things. My goodness, no. Most of these, if not all of these, came to light along my journey of acknowledging, of looking behind me and seeing what had evolved. Anyway, as I was saying, most of the time we're not walking around consciously thinking these things. They're just simply there. And they can influence the way we interpret what happens to us. They can influence the boundaries we set, what we tolerate, what we fear. My gosh, what we tolerate, you only have to look back in history and see what those poor women put up with during the war and it's pretty much the Depression, when money was tight, men would come home drunk after having spent their money at the pub, and the poor woman was lucky enough to get a few pennies to buy the groceries and got bashed about. What we fear, what we expect, and how quickly we react when something touches one of those old beliefs. And knowing something doesn't always change how we feel. This is something I think is really important. We can know something intellectually and still respond emotionally as though we don't know it at all. Oh my gosh. And that was, wow. And an example of, sorry, I digress here. It doesn't have to be in just this area either. Like when you buy yourself, sometimes you just don't think things through, and you go down the path of thinking one thing and then you respond in a totally different manner. It was crazy. You can know that I am good enough and still feel devastated when somebody rejects you. You can know I need to set this boundary and still feel terribly guilty when you do. You can know this isn't right for me and still desperately want somebody to choose you. So knowing is important, but sometimes we have to go even deeper. We have to become curious about that and ask ourselves, what sits underneath my reaction? And here's what I want to bring this into my own life. Because this isn't just something I'm talking about theoretically. Recently, I had a cancer count that had risen. Now, the fact was the fact. My cancer count had risen. But almost immediately, my mind wanted to turn that fact into a story. That's bad news. And of course, it's understandable that in my mind, it would go there. But then I had to stop, because I had to stop and analyse it. Why had it risen? And it had risen because I'd fiddled with the dosages. I was talking about back there thinking one thing and acting in a different way. Well, I was thinking one thing about the dose and then I acted in a totally different way. So I got back on track with my dose, and the next time round with my cancer blood test, it had still risen. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's going on here? Do I pack up everything and go and live on a deserted island? And then I stopped and I realised that the first time it rose by 160 over 2 weeks. This time it had only risen by 45. So the growth had actually slowed. So even while the cancer count went up, the progress had been slowed right down. And of course, this third lot of 2 weeks has shown that I am back on the right track, and it actually went down again. It actually went down. So the number had risen, but that was only the fact. The story I immediately attached to it was, oh my gosh, that's such bad news. And that distinction matters, because I'm not saying we should pretend something difficult isn't difficult. I'm not saying we should put a positive spin on everything. And I'm certainly not saying we should ignore reality. Because for me, in this cancer, really, you can't ignore the reality. I'm saying there is a difference between what happens and the meaning we immediately give to what happens. That little space between the two can be incredibly important. So let's try something together. Think about something that has triggered you recently. It doesn't have to be enormous. Perhaps someone didn't respond to you. Someone criticized you. Someone withdrew. Someone disappointed you. Perhaps you felt as though you weren't being heard. Whatever. Now ask yourself 3 questions. What actually happened? Now stick to the facts. Not your interpretation of them, not the story. Just what happened, black and white. No judging, no criticism, just what happened. Next question. What did I make it mean? What meaning did I attach to it? What story did your mind immediately attach to it? So perhaps if they didn't respond to your text, you thought, I'm not important enough for them to get back to me. They're upset with me. I've done something wrong. And isn't it interesting? Because particularly with texts, what I've learned is that they don't always go through. I can send my mum in town a text and I'll arrive on her doorstep and she said, oh, this is a surprise. Nice to see you. And I'd say, well, I did send you a text. Well, I didn't get it. And she gets her phone and sure enough, there's no text from me. So we assume that the communication, texting happens. It doesn't necessarily always ring true that it does. So I've learned from that little exercise never to assume that just because they don't get back, they are being slack or rude or whatever. And who knows, they might have got the text and just might be very, very ill. One just never knows the other side of the story. So question 3, what else could be true? So we don't have to say, how can I convince myself everything is wonderful? And just as I've said before in that other example of, my mum not receiving the text, what's another story behind this? It's not that she's ignoring me. Maybe the text didn't go through. Oh, do I send her another text? Do I ring her and speak directly with her? There could be possibly information you don't have. And look, 9 times out of 10, if not 9.5 times out of 10, the situation doesn't actually say what you initially thought it said. It was not about you. And this is where the hero's journey comes back in, because the hero's journey isn't just about what happens to us. Perhaps it's also about what we discover within ourselves because of what happens to us. And that I have found to be true in my 2 journeys. The difficult relationship, the divorce and the illness particularly showed me that. The disappointment, the change we never asked for, the door that closed, the identity we thought we would have for the rest of our lives, poof, gone. These experiences can shake us, believe me, but they can also reveal things if we allow them to. They can reveal beliefs we didn't know we were carrying. They can reveal the true person, the gutsy, gritty person inside of you. They can strip away all of those layers and allow the inner you to shine forth. They can do that in ways we've abandoned ourselves in order to keep other people happy. And once we see those things, we have a choice. So I want to leave you with a little exercise. Think of something that has been bothering you and write down what happened. Then, what did I make it mean? Or what meaning did I attach to that? And finally, what's another meaning? What else could be true? And perhaps one more question. What might this experience be showing me about myself? And for me, a lot of that was patience. My gosh, patience. I think I'm the queen of patience these days. Empathy, understanding, not from a place of blame, but from a place of curiosity, because there is a huge difference between saying, what's wrong with me, and asking, what can I learn about myself here? One creates shame, the other creates possibility. And here's a thought to take with you. Sometimes the situation in front of us is something we simply have to navigate. We cannot control everything that happens. We can't control other people's behaviour. We can't control every outcome. And we certainly can't control everything life throws at us. But we can begin to become more conscious of the story we tell ourselves about what is happening. Because remember, it's not what happens, it's not believing that it happens to us, it's believing that it happens for us. And the meaning we give it is another. And perhaps that's one of the most powerful parts of rebuilding our lives. Not pretending that what happened didn't happen. Not erasing the difficult parts. Not becoming curious about what those experiences have taught us to believe. Oh bother, I got sidetracked with the dog making his bed. But becoming curious about what those experiences have taught us to believe. And deciding whether those beliefs still belong in the woman we are becoming. So perhaps instead of only asking, why is this happening to me? We can sometimes pause and ask, what is this experience showing me about myself? And maybe that's where the next part of our hero's journey begins. Not in changing everything around us, but in understanding what is happening within us. And that's been a big part of my journey throughout these last few years with my 2 life-changing crises. And from there, we can choose what happens next. So in closing, take some time with those 3 questions. What happened? What did I make it mean? And what else could be true about it? And then perhaps just sit quietly with this one. What is this experience showing me about myself? So, until next Thursday, keep flowing, keep questioning, and keep becoming. With heart, Margarita.